One thing that I always find very helpful is to basically repeat what your client told you in a way that ensure them that you understand what they're asking.
Offshore law in Hong Kong is a crowded space, but Crystal Au-Yeung has never seen that as a reason to shout louder. As a partner in the dispute and restructuring practice at Conyers, she has built her practice at the intersection of technical rigor and the deeply relationship-driven culture of doing business in Hong Kong and the PRC. For Crystal, standing out comes down to something simpler: understanding what clients actually need, not just what they ask for.
Offshore law is a very deliberate career choice, right? It is quite different from an onshore practice. What surprised you the most when you're building career in this practice area?
I think the first thing that struck me the most was the change in client base. So I didn't realize before joining offshore that much of my client base would be formed by onshore lawyers and other professionals. Which means that my credibility is measured as much based on trust and validations by my peers, sometimes my friends, as much as by the end clients. The other thing that I think is not surprising, but shocked me the most is how international developments would have a very obvious and direct impact on offshore practice. So things like changes in international AML regimes, geopolitical developments, and market conditions, especially US market conditions. These are things that I think offshore lawyers would see the impact most imminently compared to onshore lawyers. It could be, to give you an example, it could be something like the PRC government have a policy overnight to be either very supportive or ban certain and operating an industry, and that would have a direct impact on how suddenly a lot of disputes would occur. People wanted to, get out of investments through the offshore investment vehicles.
Well, speaking of private wealth disputes,
Yes.
we know that it's often deeply involved, something really personal for the parties involved in the cases. How important is that human dimension, did you find, in your work, and how do you manage that human side of things without it necessarily getting in the way of you fighting for your clients?
Private wealth disputes, mainly people think about it as trust dispute or probate disputes.
But succession.
Yes, succession. But offshore disputes, primarily it's basically disputes arising out of structures that the offshore firm set up, right? So it could be disputes arising out of trust, obviously, companies, and also investment funds. And when we say private wealth disputes, basically it means that the people involved in these structures are family members or interpersonal relationships. So they can be in a shareholder dispute setting, they can be in a funds dispute setting, not necessarily always just probate and succession dispute. But if you are dealing with disputes involving private wealth clients, then I think the first thing that you must be very mindful is you have to be a very, very good listener, very, very patient, because if you don't get through or patiently listen through the whole family history, all the stories, all the interpersonal relationships, you just can't understand where everyone is standing, and you don't understand everyone's perspective because nothing is just purely commercial. So patience is very important, but to resist the temptation of just shutting down and treating all of those background stories as nonsense.
Do you find it hard sometimes to strike that balance? Is this always obvious?
Yes, sometimes it's hard because I think there is an element of reading between the line. So you are obviously, from my position as a litigator, I would wanted to look for important pieces of information that would help the disputes or help resolve some of the legal principles. But then you have to find those things within maybe a 3 hours long conversation that goes back to the grandfather, and then it's like, oh, this is what I need you to talk to me about more. And sometimes it's not just very as clear as commercial clients in terms of record keeping and all that. But yeah, it's difficult, but I think it's at the same time quite rewarding because they at times they treat you as a friend and a trusted family member even.
Hong Kong has been pushing hard to be a private wealth hub in recent years. From a practitioner standpoint, how's that playing out on the ground? Do you still see friction in terms of implementation?
The Hong Kong government obviously have done a lot of work to, let's say they push people to set up family offices here, which has been working very well. They reintroduced the capital investment entrance scheme. And then they are pushing Hong Kong to be digital assets holding hub. All of these I think are working, but it's not just Hong Kong. Like the friction that you mentioned is probably due to, again, geopolitical situation. I think the clients in general are quite nervous about putting everything in one jurisdiction and having just one hub for everything. Clients here do need a lot of advice in terms of, where should I base assets holding? Where should decisions be made? If I'm having a family office and I want flexibility in terms of corporate structure, but at the same time I want some sort of trust element for succession, then could some type of offshore vehicle, say Cayman Foundation, be used? If it's a digital asset, but my traditional institutional bank is not willing to be the custodian, then would the introduction again some offshore vehicle would help. I don't think that all these geopolitical or macro environment friction is affecting Hong Kong, or stopping funds to flow in and out of Hong Kong.
Do you think it helped in this situation?
I do think that it helped because of the government is doing all of those stuff that I mentioned to push for it, and also because of the strong professional backgrounds that Hong Kong has.
Right, and apart from that, you also do a lot of cross-border insolvency work. And it often means navigating different legal systems that do not necessarily or always cooperate together sometimes. Tell us a moment when the playbook simply didn't apply. And what's the most creative solution that you have to find in that scenario?
In the recent past 12 months, I think, maybe not creative, but I have been working quite hard to try to present a sort of novel or sometimes nuanced perspective to the offshore courts, something that relates to maybe a particular point in another jurisdictions that makes sense, but it might not make sense in offshore, it might make sense in the PRC legal world, or there could be public policies considerations that would explain why some companies are acting the way that they do, so that the offshore courts would have the full picture in order to make a well-informed decision as to, if there are circumstances where you should give leniency or some breathing space to a company that is actually doing their best. So I think that's probably quite rewarding recently.
Obviously, you are deeply entrusted by your clients. But nowadays, AI is handling more and more the nuts and bolts of legal work. How's that translated into managing your personal client relationships?
So I think maybe when you compare it to a decade ago, especially for litigators, the client comes to you with a story and tell you, this is what is happening to me. I don't know what to do. Can you suggest some way for me to resolve this? This will be the approach, and then you would have discussions, and then you would slowly find the way or the way forward for him. But nowadays, the initial process is probably taken by AI. The client would already have that chat with their AI agent. Yeah. And then when they come to you, they wanted to test that theory.
Yeah, what would you tell them if that situation arises? Like your client is telling you, but AI told me this and you told me otherwise.
You just have to be patient. You just have to be really patient with him. And then one thing that I always find very helpful is to basically repeat what your client told you in a way that ensure them that you understand what they're asking. So what I would usually do is that I would say, look, your story is A, B, C, and D, and what you need is this and this. What AI set out, it's partially relevant, but in my experience, this is a better way because of what I want. And they often would understand and would appreciate.
You started your career at then King & Wood Mallesons around 2011, and then you spent some time in-house before you made the move to offshore. So it's quite a journey. If you could have the opportunity to go back and give your younger selves maybe a piece of advice? Not necessarily about the law, it could be building a practice or building a name for yourself in this market. What would that be?
I think I'm quite unique compared to my peers. At a very early stage of my career, I've already developed quite an entrepreneurial mindset. So I've always been thinking about how I could differentiate myself enough and build something that is very specific, a practice that is specific enough that clients would just have to look for me. I don't need to do a lot to compete with everyone and just to outshine in a very competitive market. The easiest way is just to be very good at something specific and nuance. So I think I spot that in the offshore dispute plays early on, and if I have to go back, I would just tell myself to go for it, because at that time I was still kind of hesitating, being the first batch of local litigator thinking of transferring offshore. Because of the qualification requirements, you basically have to start all over when your peers are getting to a senior lawyer stage and you are just dropping everything and start in new jurisdictions again, effectively becoming a trainee again and learn new laws and take new qualifications. But I think it's very rewarding and worth it. Another thing that I would tell myself is probably to be more curious, both in terms of everything that's happening around me and what people are doing around me. I think that's very important. Obviously, with disputes, there is an element of learning new types of investment, new types of stories, new types of things through cases. But it would be easier if you just have all of those knowledge early on. So be curious about what your corporate colleagues is doing, what the markets are doing, and just have a lot of chats with people. And that's also another element of building relationships early on.
Is there anything that you would have done differently?
No, I don't think so.
No regret.
No regrets.
Fantastic.